Let's talk about the data management body of knowledge. Hey, this is Justin Hitt from Inside Strategic Relations, coming to you from where I get work done. My shoddy little office down here in the basement, surrounded by computer systems and my favorite books. Now, uh, why would I find this particular book one of my favorites and the data management body of knowledge? Now, I want to talk a little bit about how risk management works in a practical corporate environment. Now, there's that dynamic that we've talked about in the past where the business unit is doing things for expediency and that they haven't documented. They have in their mind some future state. They're making corrections real time in business process and very often not even executing the controls in which they had to get signed off in order to even sanction the project itself. Now, when it comes to data management, there are issues where you have the software environment is changing. So I can accept that the business may have adaptations and changes over time when it comes to how they do the work. But there's some kind of control or compliance overview group who has written a whole bunch of documentation. They've partnered with subject matter experts and they have documentation that says the work should be done a certain way. And they're going to periodically validate these controls and periodically check to make sure that any of these adaptations haven't exposed the business to problems. So, for example, one of the projects I worked on in the past, we were looking at a database system that was exporting data sets to a third party source, and the data sets need to make sure they did not contain PII, personally identifiable information. Now, the data set did not contain personally identifiable information specifically. So, the definition of personally identifiable tends to be people's names, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, phone numbers, details like that. This data set did contain the, the gender of the individual, their zip code, and one other element, and I wrote about this on the new on my message board, but usually with three data set elements that are related to the location of the individual. Like for example, it could be their last name, and it could be the zip code and the other thing. Even if the last name is obscured or their initials or something like that, you can actually find 85% of people. So the data set did not contain PII by definition, but it contained enough data elements that would allow us to do a 3 point a triangulation in effect and find 85% of the people on that list. Now, that triangulation element is only available when you go beyond simple risk management and you start looking at the data management, which is what is the meaning of the data fields and the values of those fields. So, for example, you might have a unique identifier that's built with the first three characters of their last name, a zip code or an area code. It might be built with other factors, but that string itself is unique and doesn't mean anything unless you know what the values mean. So the data definition associated with how that string is built needs to be secured so that somebody doesn't reverse engineer the string and now figure out uniquely identifiable information. So in the case that I'm describing here, and there should be a link below to the article I wrote about the three data sets that will help you find 85% of the people. That was a banking situation, and that particular set of data would have taken very time consuming sanitized data set that was being used for research and now identify as much as 85% of the people in that list tied to a financial services organization. And then the rest of the data sets were the type of bank accounts people open, were the type of credit scores and different things. And so now that data set goes from being simple, nobody's going to find anything, to very useful for a competitor. Now, another thing that in another situation, the data set included a zip code, gender, ethnicity. So there are other types of demographic information, and then whether or not that they were approved for a loan, the size of the loan, and then also a little bit more data about types of loans. Now that data set, when we're talking about third-party data, by all definitions internally, were was sanitized. It was nothing that would be a risk to the organization. Now, from a data management perspective, going in, and by the way, people don't use the stuff that's in these books. There have been so many meetings where people are inventing methods to do things. I just go over here and look it up and I say, oh, look at that. Let's look at the shareholders concern. Let's look at we're just going to use this as a guide when we're deciding what we're going to do. So in the case of this data set that was clean by all definitions, the shareholders were not, they would be concerned because the data set containing demographic information, zip codes, and then whether or not somebody was approved for a loan could be used to either detect redlining if it existed, to create a reputational risk where redlining might exist in the data set, but not be representative of the larger world. Because there's millions of bank transactions. The data set only had like 200,000 transactions. It was not necessarily a statistical sample. It was basically just dumped from a database. And out of context, there's now reputational risk. So the data was good by the business. It was good by the definitions of not including personally identifiable information. But when it came to another group, uh, legal or a reputation, it was extremely dangerous information. So the reason I keep these books on hand is because they are shortcuts. And I know a lot of people don't like it, and they'll say, well, we need to figure out a way to make sure that our data sets are well documented. And so they develop something to make sure their data sets are well documented. So, for example, if you're doing data sharing between two organizations, do you know what the data is, what it does, what's actually in those fields? And then when you share it with another organization, are they making a request to get specific information, or are you just dumping everything? The business might think it's expedient just to dump everything. Compliance and risk may say, oh my gosh, some of these fields, we know that if you combine these fields, now we're exposing either business strategy, potentially risky information, or the identities of the individuals. And then the business on the other side, it might say, well, I got too much information, and they might use something that they're not supposed to. So I've seen people develop forms and plans and models. You can literally just go in here and find out the magic, which somebody's already written down. It gets me sometimes because in 5 minutes you can go into the book, and this book is readily available. It's not a secret. You can, if you're going to talk about data warehousing, look at that. There's like a whole big model of the key areas to consider. Now, this isn't the definitive, but it's a great starting place. I've been on meetings where like 4 months they're talking about this. And I say, well, it's on page, it's on page chapter 11, page 359. I think there's a diagram. Is that what you're talking about? And they're like, oh, no, no, this is not comprehensive. This is not complete. Um, but then at the end of 3 months, this is exactly what you end up with. Again, I I love these books, and I have lots of them. And I think really the purpose of this is to understand that each of these business units are going to have their own thing. They're going to have their own challenges. And as these groups expand, so you have your front line, your second line, your third line. The third line auditors are assuming that all the documentation that you have on the first two lines is actually accurate. I think that's harder and harder to do these days because people don't understand the foundations. They don't go back to what is the basic function of this, what we're trying to do here. On the business side, when it comes to data, the basic function is that your data maintains consistency over time and that it is properly categorized so that it can be used efficiently in the business process. If the business process changes and needs more data, you can't just go ask the engineers to give you more data. You got to go update your data specification. You have to have it reviewed. All this stuff is not to make things difficult. It's because there has to be consistency. So on the first line, if your documentation is up to date, then the second line, when they do validation, they do testing, they do your RCSA, your risk and control self-assessments, you're going to be able to have consistency in those materials, and they don't have to keep going back to the business and the subject matter experts to find out what the hell they're doing. So your documentation says you're doing this. We did a validation, found out you're not doing any of that. And so now we suspect there's more problems, and it just takes longer. So if the documentation's clean, the validations are going to be cleaner. It's never going to be perfect. Finally, when audit comes in, Audit expects that as so it is documented, it shall be done. And if it's not, you get an issue, and now you've got extra work to do. Now, the auditors are so far removed from what the business is actually doing. What do you think the auditors use to govern their tests? Well, yeah, we talked about one part. They use your documentation. But in absence of documentation, what do you think they use? I know this is like a trick question. If they're doing an audit on a data warehouse, for example, this is what they use. Oh my gosh. So if you just started with this in the first place, you would be more congruent with the expectations of your audit team. So I've worked closely with KPMG, PwC, third-party audit companies and private agencies. I've actually worked with auditors quite frequently, doing consent orders, business initiatives, board level milestones, and time again, the first place they turn for what are the best practices in actually approaching these data sets is not a roundtable community discussion of what we might do. It is, again, boom, right here. Now, one thing that is challenging in my role, not necessarily challenging, it's an interpersonal challenge, not a challenge on the side of what we're supposed to be doing as risk professionals, is that I would rather start with the expectations of audit, build upon a body of knowledge that's been kind of reviewed by the community. And another reason for that is because if you hire a new person and they already know this and you're already following this, you don't have some proprietary way of doing things, then you're up and working faster. The last point I want to bring is that conflict can't be a distraction from saying, okay, great, your documentation doesn't match what you're actually doing. Let's fix that. Here's an issue. Let's fix it. There often is well, you're so antiquated. We're ahead of the curve. Uh, Being built on a body of knowledge doesn't mean that you're going to be out of date, because you can always layer on top of the foundational materials that innovative approach, but document it as an innovative approach. And when you change your work, I always tell this to businesses all the time. You got the process documentation that you submitted to get approved to charter your project. Then you have the documentation that represents whatever the hell you're describing to me. So when they describe, oh, in future state, we're going to show me the docs. I don't want to hear it. No, 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 I don't want to hear it. I was on the second line and they're telling me about this stuff, and I'm like, oh my gosh, dude, yo, whoa, 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 stop. Don't tell me any of this stuff. Show me in the documentation where you're supposed to be doing this. Because if you told this to an auditor, the auditor is going to find an issue immediately, because you're describing stuff that I don't see you doing. I don't see you're supposed to be doing it. And it doesn't sound like it's reducing risk or detecting risk. So again, it's no good to do a book review on this, because I love it. In fact, this is not my first copy of these types of books. I tend to keep them nice and neat, like little Bibles. I'm like, oh, yeah, Maya Suno. So I'm careful about it. And folks, I am a little quirky. I understand that. I look like an engineer, electrical engineer or something like that. But again, data security, data storage, data warehousing. Don't reinvent the wheel. Start with a foundation, which is I've heard people call it the DAMAC the book, because they're cussing at it or something, but it's the data management body of knowledge. Start here. Then understand that there will be human dynamics between the three different groups. Audit will have an expectation that looks more like this book, where the business is trying to facilitate activities and they're going to have kind of inventions. Okay, they're not always inventions, but ultimately what's written down in the original documentation tends to evolve over time because their demands and needs evolve over time. Now we come with the role of the second line or the frontline validation groups when it comes to control management. You really want to make sure that your documentation is easy to update, that your documentation is easy to refresh, and that you can version control it. So your document retention is important, but also your change management is important, so that when audit comes along, you can show them what audit expects plus what the business is actually doing. we can go into more detail about that. In fact, I'm writing a book on the essentials of risk management from a perspective that's probably a little bit of a unique perspective, but I wasn't the only one coming up with the stuff. We'd have sidebar conversations of the folks, we'd be on a meeting for like 3 weeks, and there'd be these sidebar conversations among the control officers or control directors, control managers. And I'd be in these conversations, and they'd say, well, why don't we just do whatever's, they don't necessarily lay out the page numbers, but why don't we just do, and they'll describe some model. And I was like, great, bring it up. Well, the other person seems like they're on a roll and we're getting a lot of good information. No, jump in there and say, are you talking about such and such a model? And if they don't know what that model is, on the sideline, you help them understand what the model is, show them where it is in the book, explain to them how audit is going to expect those kinds of models because audit doesn't have the context and experience that's inside the business. And here's the proper documentation we need to complete. When I've worked with projects and executives that are open to that, at the minimum, you will have documentation that makes sense to auditors. Beyond that, if you really want to get extra points with teacher, you will end up with documentation that is consistent and matches the current state of business as usual. You will find fewer issues, and any issues that are found are those weird, quirky things like the data set is clean according to documentation, but there's some new technology like machine learning, for example, can build out inferences. Machine learning could so databases, you could download a data set and run it through a big database and append data to it. And that appended data now reveals personally identifiable information that's used your data set as a key. All those little things can get worked out so that they don't surprise you, so that you don't suddenly have an audit finding from a regulator that demonstrates that you had this giant gap that nobody saw because you're too busy chasing down poorly documented controls and processes. That's the bottom line, folks. A lot of people ask me, how do we have fewer issues in the organization? I say more effective controls. How do we have more effective controls? Better documentation of the process that actually represents the risks that you face and in the business that you're actually doing, the work that you're doing. How do we make all that stuff easier to maintain? We simplify it by following industry best practices rather than inventing stuff. I don't know why people keep inventing stuff. Again, it takes somebody like me to tell you with no filters how this works. I hope you'll take it to heart, and I hope you'll start using some of the books of knowledge. You don't need to have a certification to know how this stuff works. You can read the book. I read the book. I don't have any certs around this thing. I just read the book, and I say, well, let's start here. And maybe it takes a dumb redneck looking hick in order to figure this stuff out. But again, what does audit expect? What does the business need to prove that they're doing what audit expects? And if things change in the business, at least have a draft of the new version of documentation that represents what you're actually doing. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, and part of what we do is we help you transform business relationships into profits, and being able to reduce the risk in your environment and identify the right parties and organizations, as well as understanding their expectations, significantly reduces your risk. It helps you find best practices, document your activities, and just removes a lot of headaches. I want to thank you for being a part of what you're listening to here, which is a podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe, ask your questions, and comment below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.